In the annals of World War II, few stories grip the heart like that of Dita Kraus, a Jewish girl enduring the horrors of Auschwitz.
It was terribly crowded, it was terribly cold, and we were extremely hungry. Every day there were dozens of dead people.
But who was she before the war? Let's turn back the pages to her life in pre-war Prague. Pre-war life of Dita Kraus. Dita Kraus's story begins in the vibrant city of Prague, born into a world that was as culturally rich as it was politically turbulent. Prague in the early 20th century was a melting pot of languages, religions, and ideas, a testament to the diverse nature of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Dita, born on July 12, 1929, entered this dynamic world in a middle-class, socialist-leaning Jewish family. Life in Prague for young Dita was, by all accounts, a typical one for a child of her time and social standing. The city itself was a hub of intellectual and cultural activity, resonating with the sounds of classical music, the fervor of political debates, and the hustle and bustle of commerce. Her family, like many Jewish families in Prague, integrated seamlessly into the broader society, participating in its social and cultural life, while maintaining their religious and cultural traditions. However, this harmonious existence was set against the backdrop of significant political changes. In the aftermath of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had disintegrated, giving rise to a new geopolitical landscape in Central Europe. Czechoslovakia, established in 1918, was a mosaic of ethnicities and languages, with Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians, and a significant Jewish population. It was a democratic republic, a rarity in a region increasingly leaning towards authoritarianism. The 1930s were a time of great change and uncertainty in Europe. The Great Depression had left deep economic scars, and political extremism was on the rise. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's ascension to power in 1933 signaled a dark turn in European politics. His virulent anti-Semitism and expansionist ambitions posed a direct threat to the Jewish communities in neighboring countries, including Czechoslovakia. For Dita and her family, these external events were distant rumblings, overshadowed by the daily rhythms of life in Prague. Dita's childhood was filled with the ordinary pleasures and pains of growing up, school, friends, family gatherings, and the small adventures that marked the journey from childhood to adolescence. Yet, the political situation could not be ignored forever. In September 1938, the Munich Agreement, a desperate attempt by European powers to appease Hitler, led to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, a region with a substantial ethnic German population, was ceded to Nazi Germany. This was a betrayal that shook Czechoslovak society to its core, and for the Jewish population, it was a foreboding sign of what was to come. The annexation of the Sudetenland was followed by further territorial losses and political upheavals. The once proud and independent Czechoslovakia was now fragmented, its democratic ideals trampled under the boots of occupation forces. For Dita's family, this marked the end of an era. The life they had known, the city they loved, was changing in ways they could scarcely comprehend. As the 1930s drew to a close, the shadow of war loomed over Europe. For the Jewish community in Prague, the future was fraught with uncertainty. The Nuremberg laws, implemented in Germany, stripped Jews of their rights and marked them as pariahs in their own land. These laws would soon find their echo in the occupied territories, including Czechoslovakia. Amidst this growing darkness, Dita's family, like many others, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. They celebrated holidays, observed traditions, and hoped for a future where the madness engulfing their continent would dissipate. But history, as it often does, had other plans. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 shattered any remaining illusions of safety. The Nazi war machine, fueled by a toxic blend of expansionism and racial hatred, began its brutal march across Europe. For Dita, her family, and the entire Jewish community in Czechoslovakia, the nightmare was just beginning. The Sudeten Crisis and its impact. The Sudeten Crisis of 1938 was a pivotal moment in the history of Europe, marking a significant escalation in the tensions that would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War II. For Czechoslovakia, and particularly for its Jewish population, including Dita Kraus and her family, this crisis foreshadowed the horrors that were to come. Czechoslovakia, established as a sovereign nation after World War I, was a mosaic of ethnicities, cultures, and languages. Among its diverse population were the Sudeten Germans, who primarily inhabited the border areas of Bohemia and Moravia. In the volatile atmosphere of 1930s Europe, the Sudetenland became a flashpoint of nationalist sentiment, exacerbated by the economic hardships of the Great Depression and the rise of Adolf Hitler in neighboring Germany. Hitler, having come to power with a platform of German expansionism and virulent anti-Semitism, saw the Sudetenland as a key step in his broader ambitions for territorial conquest. He claimed that the Sudeten Germans were being oppressed and used this as a pretext for his demands for the territory's annexation to the Third Reich. This move was part of his larger strategy to dismantle Czechoslovakia, a nation he perceived as an obstacle to his plans for Eastern Europe. The Munich Agreement, signed in September 1938 by Germany, Italy, France, and the United Kingdom, but notably excluding Czechoslovakia, marked a turning point. It permitted the German annexation of the Sudetenland in an act of appeasement designed to prevent war. This agreement is widely regarded as a tragic miscalculation, one that would embolden Hitler and set the stage for further aggression. For the Czechoslovak government and its citizens, the Munich Agreement was a betrayal by their supposed allies. The loss of the Sudetenland was not just a territorial blow, it was a psychological one, undermining the nation's sovereignty and shaking the confidence of its people. Czechoslovakia was left weakened and vulnerable, its defenses compromised and its political unity under threat. For Dita Kraus and her family, as for all Jews in Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten crisis was a harbinger of the catastrophic events to come. The Jewish community, already facing anti-Semitic sentiments, found themselves in an increasingly perilous position. The crisis underscored the fragility of their situation in a Europe where democratic values were giving way to totalitarianism and aggression. The aftermath of the Munich Agreement saw further territorial losses for Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promises and occupied the remaining Czech lands, establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Slovakia, meanwhile, was coerced into becoming a puppet state allied with Nazi Germany. These events marked the end of Czechoslovakia as an independent nation and the beginning of a dark chapter in its history. The Nazi occupation brought with it a brutal regime of repression and terror. Anti-Jewish laws were imposed, mirroring the Nuremberg laws in Germany. Jewish businesses were Aryanized, education and employment opportunities for Jews were severely restricted, and the process of social exclusion and marginalization intensified. For many, including Dita's family, life became a daily struggle for survival, marked by fear, uncertainty, and the constant threat of violence. The occupation also had profound implications for the wider society in Czechoslovakia. The democratic ideals upon which the nation was founded were crushed under the Nazi boot. Resistance movements began to form, both among Czechs and Slovaks, but they faced ruthless suppression by the occupiers. The social fabric of the nation was torn apart, as collaboration, resistance, and survival became the defining themes of the era. In this climate of fear and oppression, the Jewish community in Czechoslovakia, already isolated and vulnerable, faced existential threats. The rise of anti-Semitic propaganda, the scapegoating of Jews for societal ills, and the increasing violence against them were ominous signs of the genocide that was to come. For Dita Kraus, a young girl growing up in these tumultuous times, the Sudeten crisis and its aftermath marked the end of childhood innocence. The world she knew was changing irrevocably, and the sense of security and belonging she had once taken for granted was shattered. The values and freedoms her family had cherished were being eroded, replaced by an ideology of hate and exclusion. Life under Nazi occupation. The Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia marked a turning point in the life of Dita Kraus and her family, ushering in an era of unprecedented challenges and drastic changes. The once vibrant and diverse Czechoslovak society was now under the dark shadow of Nazi rule, which brought with it a systematic campaign of repression, particularly targeting the Jewish community. With the establishment of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in March 1939, the Nazis immediately began to implement their oppressive policies. These measures were designed not just to persecute the Jewish population, but also to dismantle the very fabric of Czechoslovak society, replacing its democratic ideals with the totalitarian doctrines of the Third Reich. For the Jewish community, the impact of the occupation was both immediate and devastating. Anti-Jewish laws, mirroring those already in place in Germany, were swiftly enacted. These laws stripped Jews of their civil rights, barred them from many professions, and excluded them from participating in public and cultural life. Jewish businesses were confiscated or Aryanized, transferred into the hands of non-Jews, often at a fraction of their value. This economic disenfranchisement was a calculated move to marginalize and impoverish the Jewish community. Dita's family, like many others, felt the crushing weight of these restrictions. The simple freedoms they had once enjoyed, such as visiting a park or attending a concert, were now denied to them. The yellow Star of David badge became a mandatory marker of their Jewish identity, a symbol of separation and stigma. This forced identification served both to isolate the Jewish population and to make them easy targets for discrimination and abuse. The educational opportunities for Jewish children were severely curtailed. Jewish students were expelled from schools, and access to higher education was almost entirely blocked. For a young, intellectually curious girl like Dita, this was a particularly bitter pill to swallow. The pursuit of knowledge, a value deeply ingrained in Jewish culture and her family, was now out of reach. The social changes under Nazi occupation were equally profound. The once cohesive Czechoslovak society was fractured by fear, suspicion, and the imposition of Nazi ideology. Neighbors turned against neighbors, and long-standing friendships were strained or broken as the Nazi propaganda machine worked to sow division and hatred. The Nazis also began to systematically segregate the Jewish population. Ghettos were established, forcing Jews to leave their homes and move into cramped, unsanitary conditions, often with multiple families sharing a single small apartment. These ghettos became centers of misery and despair, isolated from the outside world and subject to constant surveillance by the Nazi authorities. In addition to the physical segregation, the Nazis employed a range of psychological tactics to dehumanize and demoralize the Jewish population. Propaganda portrayed Jews as subhuman and a threat to society, fueling a climate of fear and hatred. This atmosphere of pervasive anti-Semitism made everyday life a gauntlet of humiliation and danger for Dita and her family. The Nazi occupation also brought with it the constant threat of violence. Arbitrary arrests, beatings, and killings became part of the daily reality. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, operated with impunity, instilling a climate of terror. Families lived in constant fear of raids and reprisals, not knowing if they would be the next to be targeted. For Dita, the occupation marked the end of her childhood. She witnessed firsthand the erosion of her community, the loss of dignity and rights, and the creeping shadow of fear and despair that enveloped her world. The vibrant, diverse Prague of her early years was now a place of oppression and persecution. As the war progressed, the situation for the Jews of Czechoslovakia deteriorated further. Deportations to concentration camps began, a grim process that would eventually claim the lives of most of Czechoslovakia's Jewish population. Families were torn apart, with many never to see their loved ones again. The journey to Auschwitz. The deportation of Dita Kraus and her family to Auschwitz stands as one of the most harrowing chapters in their story of survival. This journey, emblematic of the cruelty of the Holocaust, marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test their endurance to its very limits. As the grip of Nazi terror tightened over Czechoslovakia, the Jewish community braced for the worst. Rumors of deportations and concentration camps swirled, carrying tales of brutality and despair. For Dita and her family, these fears became a reality when they received the dreaded order for deportation. They were given only a short time to prepare, allowed to bring only a few belongings. The life they had known was abruptly and irrevocably shattered. The journey to Auschwitz began with a forced march to the collection point. Families, including the elderly, children, and the sick, were herded together, their confusion and fear palpable. The Kraus family, along with countless others, were then loaded onto cattle cars designed for livestock, not humans. The conditions in these cars were inhumane, cramped, filthy, and suffocating. There was little air, no sanitation facilities, and barely enough room to sit or lie down. The journey, which could last for days, was a torment. The train cars were sealed, with only small slits for ventilation. Food and water were scarce, leading to dehydration and hunger. The lack of sanitation facilities meant that the cars quickly became cesspits of human waste. The despair and suffering of the passengers were overwhelming, with many succumbing to exhaustion, illness, or sheer despair before the journey's end. For Dita, this journey was a brutal introduction to the horrors that lay ahead. The sights, sounds, and smells of the cattle car, the cries of children, the moans of the sick, the stench of fear and human waste would remain etched in her memory forever. It was a journey from which there was no return, a descent into a hellish world where humanity seemed to have been extinguished. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, the passengers were greeted by a scene of chaos and brutality. The train doors were flung open, and SS guards shouted orders, their dogs snapping and snarling at the terrified prisoners. The infamous selection process began almost immediately. Men were separated from women and children. The elderly and infirm were pulled aside, and families were torn apart. The air was filled with the sounds of weeping, pleading, and the merciless shouts of the guards. Dita and her family underwent this selection process, a dehumanizing ordeal that determined who would live and who would die. The criteria were arbitrary and cruel. Those deemed fit for work were sent to one side, while those considered unfit, the elderly, the sick, children, and mothers with young children, were sent to the other, marked for immediate death in the gas chambers. The survivors of the selection were then subjected to further indignities. They were stripped of their remaining possessions, their hair was shorn, and they were given prison uniforms, striped garments that erased their individual identities. They were also tattooed with numbers, a chilling symbol of the Nazi regime's attempt to reduce them to mere cogs in their genocidal machine. The initial days in Auschwitz were a time of shock and disorientation for Dita and her family. The camp was a place of unimaginable cruelty and suffering. The barracks were overcrowded and filthy, the sanitary conditions deplorable, and the food meager and unpalatable. The constant presence of death, whether from disease, starvation, exhaustion, or the gas chambers, hung heavily over the camp. For Dita, the stark reality of Auschwitz was a profound shock. The camp's brutal regime, the cruelty of the guards, and the daily struggle for survival were a far cry from the life she had known in Prague. Yet amidst this darkness, there were also moments of resilience and solidarity. Prisoners shared stories, comforted each other, and in some cases formed clandestine networks to provide extra food or aid to the sick. Life in Auschwitz, struggle and survival. Auschwitz, a name synonymous with the Holocaust's most unspeakable atrocities, became the grim setting for a significant chapter of Dita Kraus's life. The daily existence in this concentration and extermination camp was a relentless struggle against inhumane conditions, brutal labor, and the ever-present shadow of death. Life in Auschwitz was governed by a brutal routine designed to dehumanize and degrade. Each day began before dawn with a wake-up call that forced prisoners from the cramped, squalid bunks where they slept. These barracks, originally built for horses, were now crammed with human beings, with each barrack housing hundreds of inmates. The space was so limited that people had to sleep side by side, often without sufficient blankets to ward off the bitter cold. Roll call was a daily ordeal. Prisoners were forced to stand in rows, regardless of weather conditions, while the guards counted and recounted. These sessions could last for hours, especially if the numbers did not tally, or as a form of collective punishment if an inmate had attempted escape or broken camp rules. The cruelty of the guards during these roll calls was notorious, with beatings and random executions not uncommon. The food in Auschwitz was barely enough to sustain life. The typical diet consisted of a watery soup, often with rotten vegetables and a small piece of bread. Occasionally, there might be a meager addition of margarine or a scrap of sausage. Starvation was a constant threat, and the lack of nutrition, coupled with hard labor and disease, took a devastating toll on the prisoners' physical health. Work assignments in Auschwitz were varied, but uniformly harsh and exhausting. Inmates were used as slave labor in various capacities, from construction and factory work to manual labor like carrying heavy stones or digging trenches. Dita, young and relatively strong, would have been assigned to some of the less lethal work details, but this did not spare her from the brutality and exhaustion inherent in all camp labor. The psychological toll on the inmates was immense. The constant presence of death, the inhumanity of the guards, and the arbitrary nature of the violence created an atmosphere of terror and despair. The gas chambers and crematoria, ever present and ominous, were a daily reminder of the fate that could befall any inmate at any time. The smoke from the crematoria was a constant, haunting presence, a tangible reminder of the mass murder taking place within the camp. Despite the unrelenting horror, there were acts of resistance and solidarity among the prisoners. Secret networks were formed to smuggle extra food, medicine, and news from the outside world. These acts of defiance, though small in the face of the camp's brutality, were vital for maintaining a sense of humanity and hope among the prisoners. Religion played a complex role in the lives of many Jewish inmates. For some, their faith was a source of comfort and strength, a way to maintain a sense of identity and dignity in the face of relentless dehumanization. For others, the horrors they witnessed and experienced led to a crisis of faith, a questioning of how such evil could exist in the world. Resistance and rebellion inside the camp. Amid the indescribable horrors of Auschwitz, acts of resistance and rebellion, though perilous and often small in scale, served as beacons of hope and defiance. These acts ranged from clandestine efforts to maintain cultural and religious traditions to overt acts of sabotage and escape attempts. In this context, the story of Freddie Hirsch and the Block 31 Children's Barracks stands out as a poignant example of resilience and courage. Resistance in Auschwitz took various forms. On a fundamental level, simply maintaining one's humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization was an act of resistance. For many inmates, this meant clinging to religious, cultural, or personal rituals in secret, preserving a sense of identity and dignity. Smuggling extra food to fellow prisoners, teaching children, or reciting prayers were all ways in which inmates defied the Nazi regime's efforts to strip them of their humanity. One of the most remarkable acts of resistance was the clandestine education efforts led by Freddie Hirsch, a German Jewish teacher and a youth leader. In Block 31 of the Auschwitz-Birkenau family camp, Hirsch created something extraordinary: a secret school and a haven for children. Despite the prohibitions against educating Jewish children, Hirsch and his team of educators managed to provide lessons, organize sports, and create a semblance of normalcy for the children in their care. This was not just an act of educational defiance, but also a profound statement of resilience and hope under the most dire circumstances. The children in Block 31, while not spared the overall horrors of the camp, found in Hirsch a protector and a figure of inspiration. Under his guidance, they engaged in physical exercise, arts, and secret lessons that covered a range of subjects from history to languages. Hirsch's ability to maintain this block as a space where children could experience a fragment of childhood even in such a dark place is a testament to his extraordinary courage and dedication. However, the acts of resistance in Auschwitz were not limited to these subtle forms. There were also more overt acts of defiance, including sabotage of the camp's operations. Some prisoners, assigned to work details in the munitions factories, risked their lives to smuggle out gunpowder or to deliberately slow down production. These acts of sabotage were dangerous but vital contributions to the larger war effort against the Nazis.